whatever that's worth. But it's worth a lot. I think we could go ahead and get started. There may be some others that trickle in, but maybe we could just start with a round of introductions. Both we can start in person here and then go around the room and then get some introductions of folks that are on Zoom this morning. Can we start right here?
Yeah, I'm Drexel Barnes, City of Bend Water Quality and Laboratory Service.
Chris Knight, I'm the director at the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council.
More moderator.
Jim Bond, program director with the Deschutes River Conservancy.
You've already.
Oh, yeah, I'm Tanya, I'm a staff, senior planner.
Jason Wilcox, Fisheries Program Manager, Forest Service in Central Oregon, including the Deschutes that I'll present on some today.
Yeah, Ted White, I'm retired. I'm a member of ours here on the committee and next week Debbie Fish Wild.
I'm the chief watershed district manager, based on that, and
Ben Campbell, the hydropower coordinator for ODFW. Ben South, ODFW fish biologist.
Jerry George, district fish biologist for ODFW out of the Bend office. I'm also logged in online, as is Drexel. Looks like we have Sam and then Tim.
Okay, Sam, Van Lanningham, Oregon Water Resources here in Bend.
Tim Porter, the assistant district fish biologist for ODFW out of Bend and Prineville.
Thanks, Tim and Sam. Anybody else online there that we can't see? Okay, well, yeah, I don't remember how this idea came about to have kind of the monitoring palooza. It's one of our previous meetings and there was just a, hey, Lori.
sorry, everybody, dragging out the city council till 11 p.m. last night.
Get a pass. And we just did a round of introductions. We just been around the table. So if you want to jump in and introduce yourself,
Yes.
perfect time.
Yeah, Lori Faya with the City of Bend Environmental Resources Manager.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I don't remember how this came together, but at a previous meeting, we said, wouldn't it be great to get all the folks, not all the folks, but most of the folks together that are doing monitoring in the Upper Deschutes and Tumalo Creek. And so I think this is how this came together. And so Kate and I had reached out. Kate just left for vacation midweek, so she asked me to help facilitate the meeting, but a number of folks were willing to give presentations today, and so we've got almost 3 hours set aside for some presentations about monitoring. I think the one group that I wasn't able to connect with was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're not specifically represented on this committee, but I had thought about trying to get an update on Oregon spotted frog monitoring, but maybe that can be for a future presentation. But yeah, so I think these times are pretty flexible. I was just hoping to leave a little time at the end to kind of have a wrap up discussion about, how do we want to meet about monitoring in the future, and how do we just perhaps collaborate a little more around monitoring the Upper Deschutes. And then I just need to be out here at 11:45, so that's kind of my hard stop. But yeah, folks I think we've got the room until noon, right? Yeah. So Drexel, we were hoping you might be willing to kick it off today and share a little bit about the city's water quality monitoring work.
Sure, no worries. Let's see if I can share my screen.
Join us too.
Looks like Jeff maybe join the meeting. Jeff, would you mind? We just did a round of introductions. If you'd be willing to say hello to the group.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Bysted, with the City of Bend, and I run the monitoring program for the city. One of the various areas that we work on is the Deschutes River water quality monitoring of the Deschutes River and Tumalo Creek, and so we're in charge of all the data and the monitoring of that. And and reporting all of our data to DEQ.
Thanks, Jeff.
Great.
Yeah,
For those of you who don't have our screen, is there a way to increase the brightness on
oh yeah, we just turn the lights down.
the brightness might help?
Oh, on the laptop.
Yeah, I think-
Okay. Yeah, that's just on the laptop itself.
Well, it's not doable. That's all.
You'd be under picture.
Yeah. Clearly, we're experts. I'm definitely an expert here. Oh, my goodness. Whoa. Oh, oh. Look at that. That's as bright as it gets.
Very good.
Okay, you're welcome. Now how do we get back? It's genius at work, you guys. It just times out. That's it. Okay.
Oh, now we can.
No.
Well, should we? Maybe it'll just.
We don't navigate yet to the beginning.
I'm stuck.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks very much.
That is better.
So again, I'm Drexel, currently I'm the water quality and laboratory services manager for whatever that means in the city of Bend, but I will lean on Lori a little bit and Jeff a little bit in their respective areas. Jeff's right, he runs the field sampling and monitoring program at the city of Bend, which among other things, many other things, performs all the ambient water quality monitoring. We started in 2004, so I thought I'd just go through how we started. 2004 was a memorandum of understanding between the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the city. Actually, there were two memorandums between 2004 and 2009, monitoring from 2004 to 2009, and the purpose of the project is to gather baseline water quality conditions throughout Bend, evaluate trends locally and regionally. It said it resulted in an Upper Deschutes Watershed Council report. Leslie Jones, Ryan Houston. Mostly it was aimed at the 303D listed parameters as the from on the Deschutes as it runs through Bend, and also a little bit on Tumwater Creek. So we started in 2004. That's why I'm not a hydrologist, biologist, geologist. I'm a chemist. And so is Jeff. That's our background in the laboratory. So we kind of got into this by accident, but it was a good diversion from lab time, getting out in the field and doing this monitoring.
And does everybody know what the 303D list is?
Unfortunately.
Yeah. I figured I was going to share the hip hop.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right now, from 2010 to present, we continued water quality monitoring. It's changed slightly over the years. We still do it to increase understanding of water quality. We do submit all of our data to that integrated report that feeds into the 303D list for the state of Oregon. We still list this in our sampling plans to inform TMDL efforts, and it's funny because I was going through emails, preparing for this. I had an email in 2009, 2010, 2011, I think that said the TMDL was imminent, and of course, here we are. But we're still gathering the data if it ever comes through, we'll have some pretty current temperature data, at least in this stretch. We also submit the data to DEQ as part of our, it's not required stormwater permit compliance, but it is one of the, since we're monitoring, we do report it. As everyone knows, or probably should know, that City of Bend has a discharge permit for stormwater in the City of Bend. It's a small MS4 and ES permit. Like I said, there's no monitoring required for that, but we do use it as a, I guess, best management practice.
Yeah, and what's interesting for Ben's, we actually have 2 stormwater permits from DEQ. So one is for what Drexel explained, the MS4 permit. And that allows discharges of stormwater to the river. And then we have another stormwater permit, WPPF permit, that allows discharge of stormwater into the ground, so into eventually groundwater. And what's interesting is the latter, that the WPCF permit does require us to sample stormwater and to characterize the nature of that stormwater as related to what's being discharged into the ground. And because of that, we are determining what the typical concentrations of stormwater pollutants are, regardless whether it's going to the river or going into the ground. But our MS4 permit does not require us to do this ambient monitoring. I think the history, like Drexel said, was largely because we were concerned about TMDLs coming along and whether or not the city would likely be named as a designated management agency and what that might mean for discharges to the river. Our permit says if we do collect data, we have to submit it to DEQ. And then it does require us this November to make a determination of whether we think best management practices we're applying for stormwater management, like cleaning catch basins and sweeping the streets and requiring erosion control on construction sites and stuff like that, is enough. So we have to make kind of a qualitative statement that we think we're doing management practices to the maximum extent practicable. So
What's the issues currently listed for?
it's listed for temperature. It's which
I'll get to it here.
Drexel will get to it. Thank you. Yeah, break it not on yet.
Yeah, and I'll just say, along with that, at various times, city manager, city council come forward, this is a good idea, but it's not required. So I'm, as someone, Jeff and I, who prepared the budget to make sure that we can do this, it's a small part of our budget, but we're always looking for a reason to do this and to assign to this. So collaboration, it would be important to us, just because if we can point to something and say, hey, we're feeding data into this group, this effort, it helps us justify it. We've never had a problem really, but still helps us justify it. The one requirement that is part of our monitoring that we do is a special use permit that we hold with the Forest Service to operate our watershed, which of course then gets about 60% of its water from the Bridge Creek watershed west of town. And so in managing that watershed with the Forest Service, we have a special use permit. There's a whole page, I'll share this presentation with everyone, and there is a link on this presentation to our special use permit page. This map shows a little bit of the reaches affected of Tumalo Creek by the special use permit, but that is the one of the things, one of the stations in, I think it's Chevron Park in particular, that our temperature data that we monitor there goes right to that special use permit. And
So the special use permit actually has 3 locations that we're just not just collecting all the data, but there's 3 locations where data needs to be collected, and it's flow and temperature, and also then fisheries, fish information, fish counts. And so some of those are being done by Forest Service. We're paying for gauging with USGS and also Oregon Water Resources Department, as well as maintaining one ourselves. but that's been a requirement for the past 10 years, is that we collectively put together a report of that data annually. That the fish information is collected every other year. And now we're working with the Forest Service to look towards extending and continuing collecting that data.
Thank you, Lori. My presentation's not necessary anymore.
Yeah. Well, we were careful, I put, like I said, I put that link to our page, and on our page, you can get to some of the data, I'm not exactly sure what all of it. You can get to,
So
like,
we have, there's a bunch of continuous, like
Yeah.
live data you can get for flow. And then the other thing is that the Forest Service puts together these awesome reports for us every year and every other year. And we post those up there as well, and it has some really interesting data to show, I think, the benefits of the project that the city had constructed up there, improvements to the intake facility, where now we, at kind of shoulder seasons of the year, we don't take as much water out of Tumalo Creek as we used to. We used to take our full 18.2 cubic feet per second up by Tumalo Falls, put it in a 10-mile-long pipeline, take out what we needed of that at our Outback water filtration facility and dump the rest back in Tumalo Creek by Shovelin Park. And now we only take what we need at Tumalo Falls. So there's that stretch of creek that we're seeing the benefits from a temperature standpoint and a fish standpoint. I'm sorry for saying, I'm just like introducing right.
yeah, I was careful not to put any.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. You know, we'll cascade into the fishery focused talk in a couple hours here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say just one on that stretcher that you're not putting that, where you're not putting that water back in. That's a huge benefit relative to the sedimentation that there was a number of times, at least one major time when the erosional aspects of that just flooded the creek with sediment to the point where it's just we had pretty queue in deal with the city.
Yeah.
And so there's benefits in that regard.
Yeah, it's a much better system now. So the assessment units, as they go through town, on the left-hand side here are the 303D, the integrated list assessment units of the shoots as they go through town. So there's North Unit Dam to White Creek, basically from North Unit diversion north, and then Spring River, from Spring River to North Unit diversion dam. These are our sites, site numbers, basically just reflect river miles. And the site names. I'll throw up a map of them here in a second, but basically 12 sites over the years. That's changed between 12 and 13, 13 and 14, depending. Only one on Tumalo Creek right now, but we kind of bracket the Tumalo Creek, the mouth of Tumalo Creek upstream and downstream with these two sites. Oh, if you can see my mouse, sorry. And then, starting at the southern urban growth boundary, which is exactly where the I know Ben Parks is still proposing a footbridge right there, but basically the Good Dog River Rim Trail area. We also have a site at the COID diversion right off of Brookswood in that area, and that's been that is part of the challenge of these sites. Is some of them have sonds, logging sonds in them, and most of them, all of them have temperature monitors. I think not Coco brand, I can't remember the brand, but anyway, finding a place that they're secure and being able to secure them has been a challenge. And so sometimes some of the data over the years from 2004 even to now has changed site where we collect the continuous data and where we just do grabs. This is the site sample with a legend of where we do grab samples. So we do grab samples at every site, basically. The black squares, the black triangles are continuous temperature loggers, and we try to do those at every site. We have lost, I don't know how many temperature loggers, not temperature loggers at Columbia Park Footbridge, which is a great site to monitor, but like we just decided it's not worth, in that stretch, it's not worth losing a logger every year, basically. And it's not even the paying for the data loggers, it's just losing that data sucks. So, anyway, and then the are where we have continuous monitoring, so the COID diversion upstream, we have one in Mirror Pond, these are continuous monitoring sondes, YSI sondes. Archie Briggs Crossing, we struggle with the south end too, like where to place it that's secure and accessible. We have right now the Archie Briggs Crossing, and there is a secure site close to Tumalo State Park. These are the parameters that we monitor for. Like I said, they're aimed mostly at that integrated report and the 303D list, but mostly it's analyses that we can do in our own lab, so we don't have to send anything out. We have over the years sent out a few samples here and there for chlorophyll A or something that we couldn't analyze, but basically we have a pretty full service environmental lab. It's aimed at wastewater and drinking water, and so not always every parameter is applicable, but we were able to throw together this list and be able to do all the analysis ourselves, basically. The bacteria, of course, we were able to do, and the nutrients we do method 300 ion chromatograph. The multi-parameter sonde here is listed for a dissolved oxygen pH, specific conductance, temperature, and turbidity. We do just grabs. We've experimented with, you'll see in the data, we've experimented with continuous turbidity monitors on those sondes and haven't had much luck. There's some reasons for that. But the continuous monitoring of temperature, like I said, every site, dissolved oxygen, specific inductance, pH on those sondes. So about 4 sites through the river. And here's a map just to visually show you the southernmost southern UGB here, right here, just off of Rimrock Trailhead, or accessible by Rimrock Trailhead. COID diversion is just off of Brookswood, and then through town at some different sites. Like it's going backwards, most of these sites we scouted and established with Upper Deschutes Watershed Council in 2004 as impacted reaches or significant reaches either behind or above impediments, and kind of trying to bracket some good data. Our Tumalo Creek site right there in Chevron Park, and then those two that kind of bracket the mouth of Tumalo Creek, downstream of Tumalo State Park and just upstream. Here are the listed 303D listed stretches. I think this is correct. This is from here on out. I'm basically paraphrasing. I forgot to mention we have ESA, Environmental Science Associates, prepare reports for us semi-regularly. They did one in 2020 and 2022, and so this I'm borrowing heavily in all the rest of the slides from their summary of the data. But basically, we haven't contracted for the next one yet. We're kind of waiting to see if we can do it ourselves. But it does add a little bit of layer of objectivity, or to have ESA gather this data and do it for us. They've also helped us get all of our data, which is voluminous, into the right format so that we can report it to DEQ for the integrated list. So the listed stretches here, let's see. Spring River, upstream reach to North Unit Canal is listed for temperature, year-round pH, year-round turbidity, and sedimentation. The North Unit diversion to White's Creek stretch is listed for temperature and not pH. There is some discussion, about that pH listing, that I'll get to in a second. It was delisted in 2021, I think, in the integrated list. And so, I've been telling people all the time that our data helped delist it. Except for ESA found that actually our data showed that the listing was confirmed, so I don't know why. Why, I haven't gone back to the integrated list to find out exactly why it was delisted or what data was evaluated. I know our data was part of the evaluation, but our data kind of confirmed that listing. And the turbidity listing and sedimentation listing are tough ones, important ones when it comes to stormwater, but hard to delist. It says they're based on an event. The 10% above background during an event, and they were listed, I think, in the 90s. That stretch, and so it's hard to monitor in a way that could lead to delisting and even to compliance for stormwater. But we do look at. I'll discuss turbidity a little bit in a sec. Feel free to stop me with any questions too. I'm sorry. I'm going through this, and there's a lot here. Visually, I tried to fit in the visual in something that would make sense, but basically that red line on all those graphs is the 18C temperature criteria. You can see that in most stretches, it's hard to read. Tumalo Creek is at the very bottom, so it's the one at the very bottom left. It's the one that's attaining, but in most stretches in the Deschutes, at some point in the water year, we will, this is the 7-day moving, 7-day average temperature. And so, yeah, we reached that 18C and above criteria on the regular in most sites that we monitor. Yeah, that first bullet point. In the summer, we occurring a greater percentage of the time more at the downstream sites. We just think as the water slows, at the different impoundments, impediments, and divergence through Bend, and then less water flowing, it's more likely to heat up, at least incrementally. I mean, you can see it's not a huge difference. One of the things that we've said that this shows is that the river coming into Bend and leaving Bend, for temperature at least, is not that greatly different. So there is, I don't know if we can draw a conclusion there, but that's what we kind of think.
Difference in the first 4 curves and then the 4 on the right. Like I'm trying to see the years down there.
Yeah, and it's hard to read. Each of them is from 19 to August or April 19 to December 22. So 4 distinct water years, basically. And
it's actually
yeah,
10
it's
different sites.
column. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah, the left column and right column. The Tumalo Creek, like I said, I pointed out, is the bottom left column, and it is the one that is not exceeding criteria, obviously. So yeah.
Yeah, it's not surprising, right? You're just looking at a classic, relationship with the proximity to spring fed groundwater hyperric flow, right?
Yeah.
Top of the watershed, you're meeting this magical 18 degrees C threshold that's, based upon, fisheries, but in reality, we're seeing exceedances like this all over the National Forest System land and public land as well throughout the Crooked. Obviously, it's commonplace to have the exceedance of that 18C if you're not right on top of spring inputs.
Yeah, and it's yearly consistent year to year.
It is.
Yeah, so like yeah, someone after I'm gone can assign cause and anthropogenic versus, but yeah, it's very consistent.
Can you speak to, or will you, in subsequent slides, speak to the observations that were made around the now infamous heat dome? As it pertained to temperature?
We haven't drawn any conclusions from that or tried to, which would be interesting, to see.
Yeah, it's a bit of a blip, but dilution was the solution there. I think it's a general observation that, yes, it took a very extreme, driver to even register on a thermograph.
Right.
And that's the other key here is that, from a municipal water source, the big aquifer that feeds Tumalo Creek, Bridge Creek is, critical lifeblood going forward when we're seeing events like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, it's eerily consistent and even if the heat, and if the hottest time of the year is the beginning of August, basically versus the last of August, we don't see a lot of shifting in that at the peak of that curve. It's consistent. It has been, we've been looking at it for 18 years, I guess. I'm not doing that right. Almost 20 years. These are the last 4, but based on that, it's consistent at least. The time of year that we're reaching that peak, and even a super hot September, say, will not take us over that criteria. The watershed, the river is surprisingly resilient to that heat. So.
Let's also just remember when we're looking at these data that they're very much related to a excessively altered hydrograph. And so that magical 18 degrees is a biologically based threshold that requires that natural hydrograph. So let's remember that.
Yeah, that's good.
I think it's also interesting when you think of the chutes that, not only is it incredibly managed, but also the different stretches of the chute, like the stretch that we're monitoring is a losing stretch of the river. The groundwater is way, 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 way under it versus like you go upstream a little ways, south of Bend, back where the groundwater is directly accessing the Deschutes River. And this data is not those locations.
Right.
That second note is just that, this data confirms those listings, on the 303 list. Continuous pH. We had exceedances at least one site, in each, Deschutes River assessment unit at some time, over the entire monitoring duration. Here's that note about the 303 unit listing for the north unit to White Creek was removed in 2022, but that's not what we saw. Basically, our data confirmed the listing, so I'm not exactly sure what how it was removed or delisted from the integrated report, but it would be interesting to go back through that data and see. pH data, of course, gets really less of a line, more of a blur in that diurnal variation, but that red line is the 8.5 pH criteria, and same 4 years in each column from January 19 to January 23. So yeah. pH graph data kind of confirms it. It's not near as voluminous. We take pH every time we graph back at the lab. Or actually on a handheld calibrated meter, but it basically confirmed that you see exceedances at certain points of the year. It's really hard to read that this is Mirror Pond, and you can see an exceedance of almost 10 in pH, but there are various readings that are either flirting with or over that, 8.5 pH.
Where are you attributing the old mill? pH exceeds to?
I don't know. Let's see. So that is the old mill right there. You know, there's been discussion, there's been a lot of discussion, but our data hasn't confirmed it. We haven't looked for it. About all the human activity, about floaters and everything. I can tell you, anecdotally, you know, we don't see a huge influence in what we're measuring, but we might not be measuring everything. pH exceeds like that for a grab sample could be attributed to something like the human activity in that stretch.
Could have been just an outlier or a data error because that's out of place. Not say that was the case. You could have just done an unlucky grab sample.
Yes.
Timing with input, nutrient input.
But I mean, there's no denying that there's a lot of influences on especially that stretch. Like, you know, there are people using the river and accessing it and taking all sorts of, you know, personal care products and sunscreen. I know that that's been in the news about the sunscreen and the ocean, but that seems like a pretty significant exceedance to blame on. I don't know.
You can probably blame it on my kids.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say, it could be any one of my family too.
Yeah, I might add, there was a time when they were building the water park too, that there was a huge amount of sediment going downstream at that site. So it might be attributed to that as well. I can't read the timeline, but
Let's see. It looks like in April, spring of 2020.
That's well after the other.
Yeah, and that, yeah,
You don't need to dwell on it.
yeah, no, there's all sorts of interesting, things that pop up when you go through the data. Here's our turbidity grab data, like I've mentioned, our turbidity, continuous data, we struggle with being consistent, and in general, turbidity instruments aren't designed for this watershed. It's too low. The variations you'll see in the instrument and the person taking the sample and doing it is greater sometimes than the actual turbidity itself. I think we've made there is a correlation to be made that spring it's a little higher, and it's a little higher down in the downstream stretch during the spring. But when you're talking any turbidity below 10, it's really hard to bring out a trend like that. It's really, over the years, I've wanted to or tried to conceive of some way to link turbidity to sedimentation, but it's next to impossible. And like I said, what I think we're seeing a lot with a lot of the turbidity data is just that you're down at the bottom of the detection and seeing noise, basically. But in the spring, in general, it will be higher in the 6 to 7 range, and usually in the April or May sampling event that takes place. And you see that pretty consistently from one site to another.
So as all the water is being turned on in the system.
It corresponds with that, yeah, it definitely does, and this is 19 to 22 data. So, you know, we have a new flow regime that turns on a little slower. It's hard to assign anything to, you know, a blip of looking at Tumalo State Park's a bad example, but like, well, I guess we'll use Tumalo State Park. You know, from 2.5 to 5. That's so low, and you know, I deal with turbidity in wastewater and drinking water, and it's difficult to read any matrix that low and that consistent. But if there's anything to be inferred from this, it's just the possibility of it being a little higher when they're turning on irrigation, in the spring is there. Dissolved oxygen, this is non-spawning, so, year round, if I'm, reading it correctly. And dissolved oxygen, criteria, of course, you want the reading above the criteria, so Lori and I had this discussion of an exceedance of criteria doesn't exactly sound like the right terminology, because you're looking at something below the criteria, but.
Yeah.
But, anyway, this is for, non-spawning, let's see, was not met, North Unit Dam to the stretch was not met at Mirror Pond during the late summers of 2020, 2021, and 2022, basically. Mirror Pond is the top right. And the other sites are COID diversion right there above, then Mirror Pond, Archie Briggs Crossing just below, and Tumalo State Park far below. And you can see some gaps in the data. That's usually with data loggers, either probes becoming occluded, jammed, fouled, or the data doesn't pass UC. So that's why you'd see these like this peak here is missing. So. And this is the spawning criteria, so it's much higher, 11, I think. For the 7-day average minimum DO concentration spawning period, all sample sites exceeded the criteria. This is where we had the discussion. They were below the criteria at all sites. One of the recommendations that we had over the years is to do more, if I'm remembering correctly, spawning is during the winter. Or spring, I should say. So doing more springtime continuous monitoring, which is always hard, getting continuous data loggers out there and calibrated in the winter time. And not iced up, not accessible or being accessible. So that is a point of further study, basically, doing some more wintertime, early springtime monitoring. Nutrients we look at in the grab samples. In general, the nitrates, nitrate and nitrite are routinely below our even reporting limits. We'll have some above our reporting limit, which is 0.05 milligrams per liter. But basically, it's almost non-existent and total nitrogen in the system. We measure orthophosphate and total phosphate, two different methods. And so mean orthophosphate across the river in all years, a little variation, 0.0063 milligrams per liter. Orthophosphate and Tumalo Creek range from, the detection limit is 0.049. Across all sites of the Deschutes River, all years was 0.076, which exceeds the EPA guidance concentrations for ecoregion 2 and 3, which, if I'm correct, we span in these stretches. I'm not sure. And we do look at total coliform E. coli. We get a lot of questions about this, just because of the human activity in the river. We have seen some big spikes between 2020 and 22. We didn't see a large spike, but there is and by spike, I mean, things that are off the chart at like 2,500 coliform per 100 mil sample. We had one sample that was 2,400 in the Deschutes River. We see this range quite a bit, and depending on where you're sampling and what you're sampling, I've noticed when I used to be doing the sampling, taking notes is vital. I was sampling downstream of a flock of geese one time, and it was huge, so, you know, you see those kind of influences on Tocol from Nicola, and these tests, obviously, they do them at, you know, recreational beaches and things like that, they're designed for drinking water, wastewater, and, not perfectly adapted for natural systems. So, the numbers are kind of all over the place with Tocol form, I think even drawing the correlation between the time of most human activity in the river or floaters and the numbers has been difficult. The correlation is just not there. But they're more a hit or miss sample. These are the recommendations from the essay, and I'll just go through them. Based on, you know, the stormwater discharge, they recommended that we try to integrate precipitation data into some of our data to be able to maybe correlate some storm event influence on the data. They want us to try and evaluate spatially and temporally variations of the data. Statistical correlation of natural and anthropogenic. That's a tough one. I don't know, you know, it's a recommendation. I don't know how we would go about that, especially the size and scope of our monitoring. This is an interesting one, develop an interactive map, and then the last one, create comprehensive water quality database. We've looked at that from a lot of different directions, and it would be great to get not just our data, but everything together in a regional, you know, watershed, either map or database. I know that the Upper Deschutes watershed holds most of the data available, and it's, you know, it's available online and everything. I don't know if the benefit is there for a regional database, but it's a recommendation. It would be easier to look up that. I know that would be something that we'd be interested in maybe collaborating with, but. And just this is the references to those reports. They're available. I don't think we have them publicly facing on the website site. So if you email me or email the city in general, you'll get to me. I can get you these reports. They're available to the public, shared with the public. I just don't think we have a web page stood up to distribute them or you know, talk about them. The last reference is just that 2010 report from UDWC with city data, city and UDWC data. That was a little hard to find. I couldn't find it on you guys' website page, and I couldn't find it consistently on ours. But I did look back at it and pull this data together. But yeah. Sorry, 221.
No, that's okay. Yeah, thank you, Drexel. And I was just thinking, I think I'll try and get all these presentations, get PDFs, and then send them out to the whole committee after the meeting at some point, just so we can all get copies of those.
Yeah,
if the presenters are comfortable with that. Yeah, so I'm thinking you know, I would encourage folks to just take breaks as you need them. But let's just keep rolling, and we'll switch over to Ben and
Hey, Chris, can I have one question for Drexel real quick?
absolutely, and we can make time for questions at the end also.
And probably, maybe I should mute myself. Relative to Mirror Pond situation and all the work that you guys have done, you know, with the Sip-Core Dam hydro facility, what is the residence time of, how does that change once you get below the rapids and then say hits Galveston Bridge? What's the residence time of the water from, say, the Galveston Bridge down to the dam itself?
We don't know. I mean, it's, in fact, it's interesting when you talk about Mirror Pond. I mean, that's really not been a City of Bend thing, right? The Parks and Rec District thing. There was past history of like who's causing the sediment in the bottom of Mirror Pond, and a suggestion that that's coming out of the city's stormwater outfalls. We have so little proportion of the city that actually drains directly to the river. Vast majority drains into the ground. I think our proportion is probably pretty darn low versus what's coming from upstream. But we don't know, and we haven't been put in the position of that being required of us to know, and we have to justify use of ratepayer money on what we collect, or we collect way more than we're required to. And I'm interested in this collaboration and talking about, efforts to put this together and think about what we should be focused on and what we should be trying to achieve with data. It will help us justify what we do, but also maybe, reap benefits of everybody working together collectively on things.
The short answer is, I don't know, and.
Oh, sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I'm not sure that anyone exactly has looked at that. I know that we've done, bathymetry and just mapped the channel map, but I don't know that we looked at flow and residence time, and it does obviously change quite a bit.
I would think that might be something that, that Parks and Rec through their plan for that whole
Yes,
specific work would look at.
and I don't know that they haven't, but I don't know, I haven't seen. Yeah.
Just curious,
Maybe
thank
we
you.
should ask them.
Okay, so switching gears to Ben. Ben, we might just try and keep you within 35 minutes or so if possible, and I was just gonna point out, for those that aren't on this committee, most of the monitoring work that Ben and ODFW lead, and that Ben's gonna be presenting on, is funds that come through this committee from COID as part of mitigation. So, and I was just gonna mention that, in our recent meetings, there's been discussions of this monitoring work and the cost going up, and ODFW and Upper Deschutes Watershed Council did partner. We submitted a grant to OWEB in April to support, continuing this monitoring work and actually increasing it and expanding it. And so submitted that one in April, and we'll know by fall if we get that funding. And that would cover, we applied for 2.5 years of funding roughly to supplement the funds coming from COID. So fingers crossed that comes through, but yeah. Thanks, Ben, for presenting.
And I'll just say, I guess in the interest of speed, you want to write down any questions, and then we can maybe hit those at the end, if there's a possibility that it's going to be on the next slide or something along those lines. But yeah, so this is pretty much what I've gotten up to for the past, I don't know, 4 years or so, including last year's data and all that. So we'll get into Upper Deschutes adult sampling, the North Canal Dam, fish passage, macroinvertebrate sampling, some young eager trout monitoring, brown bullhead removal, and also the temperature monitoring. And so for the background for the Upper Deschutes, that's our where we do some adult trout raft electrofishing in the fall yearly. And so I've got the wiki up, reservoir levels and what they release out as just sort of background information, because that's where we shocked it into the reach that's directly below the dam. And so this is what influences that. As you can see, it's pretty consistent over time. In 2018, we had a complete fill, but that's the last time we've had that in the past 6 years. Of wiki up, and then the release, you can see there's that peak in the summer for irrigation flows, and then there's that mandated 100 CFS in the winter, and it, hits that pretty much every winter. But we definitely keep it right on the line. And so the point of this part is to monitor the fish populations for changes related to that flow regime of the Deschutes River below Wiki Up Dam. And that's why we focus on this reach specifically. And so this map shows where we do the sampling. As you can see, there's a Wiki Up Reservoir, so that's the dam that arrow is pointing to. And the highlighted yellow reaches are where we float and use the raft electrofisher. And so we start at the dam itself and go all the way down to the Wyatt boat ramp. And we shock 8 of those 14 kilometers. We do it in the fall after the irrigation water has been turned off, so that we get a better sample of what's in there.
you know, we condense the fish, there's less space to sample, all that sort of thing. And then also in 2021, we did these same reaches before the water got turned back on again, so end of March. And this is the first year that I'm really talking about that, because up until now, what we've seen hasn't been that much different from what we've seen in the fall. And so just getting into it, this past year, 2023 in the fall, it's the most total fish that we've captured thus far in the past 6 years. And this graph has number of fish on the y-axis and species on the x. And so you've got brown trout far left, red band next, kokanee, and then whitefish. And to sort of put this in perspective, the mountain whitefish we try to, there's tons of them up there. And so after we get like the first 200 or so, we try to limit just for incidental catch. And so that's why that number was relatively consistent over the years. And I'll get to why there's a spike in 2023 in a second. But the cool thing to notice is that we're seeing more brown trout and more red band in the system in this past year. There's more red band than browns by a little bit, which has been cool to see. There's not been any kokanee in the past couple of years, but the last 2 years we've also had a minimum pool left in Wikia. So I think in 2022 it was 8% left, and maybe this past year it was 12, 13, something like that was left in the reservoir. So it didn't go all the way down to Run River because that reservoir is not screened. And then this is looking at the average length of fish captured over the years. You got the length in millimeters on the y-axis, and then again species on the x. And so the thing to notice with the brown trout, this year we saw, or in 2023, they had a significantly smaller average size than in all the previous 4 years, or all previous 5 years. The rainbow trout this year and the year before, significantly smaller than the previous 4 years. Kokanee, again, we didn't catch any. And then the whitefish as well, we saw a significantly smaller size average compared with the previous 5 years. And then we'll break it down into like individual species for a minute. So we'll start with the whitefish, and we looked at condition factor, and that's a measure of length to weight and how that fish stacks up. The graph shows the condition factor on the y-axis and then the length of the fish on the x. The red line shows is across at the 1.0 mark, and that's considered to be a fair condition fish. So better than that is what we would like to see. The interesting thing that we saw with the whitefish, because we've only been looking at condition for the past 2 years. In 2022, it was 1.14 was the average, and it dropped significantly down to 0.98 in 2023. Not really sure why that is, but there's some speculation that we can do in a bit. And then this is looking at the length frequency histogram of mountain whitefish. And so you have a count of fish per size class. So count of fish is on the y-axis and length is on the x. And the thing that you can notice from this is the past 3 years, we haven't really seen the larger fish. So many of those above, 450, 500, which we saw in 2018 and 2020. And then the other thing that's interesting is that there's been a minimal difference in the population structure over these years. And so 2018 is when we started the mandatory 100 CFS for overwinter flows for this reach. And that hasn't really changed what we've seen in the whitefish population structure. And then we're going to add in the spring sampling, and the arrows just help you track year to year. And again, we don't really see much of a difference. It looks like way more fish, but the x or the y-axis is a smaller scale. The scale is consistent for spring and fall, but like on the spring, it only goes up to 30 compared to 80 on the fall sampling. And again, the population structure seems relatively stable. We see reproduction, we see overwinter survival. Next, we'll look at brown trout. The condition factor for those, again, conditions on the Y and length is on the X-axis. And the cool thing that we saw with those is that the average condition factor improved from 0.99 in 2022 to 1.07 in 2023. It was, statistically not significant, but, perhaps biologically. And that's the direction that we want to see these fish going, is becoming healthier and fatter and having a better life in that river. And then looking at the leak frequency histogram for the brown trout, again, we've got all 6 years. In 2022, we started to see less of the biggest fish, so not really much above 600 millimeters. But they're still the biggest fish that are in the river there. And then the other really cool thing that you can see down here in 2023, we have a really big juvenile age class that we captured that fall, which we hadn't seen really in any of those 5 years previous. And so that's potentially indicative of improving conditions in that stretch of river. And then to add on to that, in the past 4 years that we've done the spring sampling, up until this past year, you don't really see any overwinter survival of those little guys until this year, which is awesome. And so we're seeing like that big bump in the little tiny guys making it through the winter, which is also really important, having, a healthy, sustainable fishery up there. And so, yeah, that's we've got recruitment all of a sudden, which is awesome. And then last, we'll get into the red band. Generally speaking, their condition was already solid. They were already over that 1 mark for the average. However, again, their condition improved this past year. And so we have the condition factor on the Y-axis and the length on the X. I guess I didn't say this for the other two, but it's the same throughout. The black dots are 2022 and blue is 2023. The little zoom thing's covering up that part of the graph on the screen here. So I forgot to say it. But average condition has improved for the red band. Again, it's not statistically significant, but biologically, it's moving in the right direction. And then the other thing that was kind of interesting was that the red band were consistently higher than the brown trout. And so in 2022, red band had a higher condition factor. In 2023, again, red band had a higher condition factor. Not 100% sure why that is, but because that's during the brown trout spawning season, there's the potential that maybe they've lost a little weight due to spawning. But a lot of times too, we haven't seen, a ton of eggs or milk coming out of the fish that we're sampling, and so it's maybe not the issue. All right, and then looking at the red band trout, the leak frequency histograms, the thing to notice here is consistently we're lower than the brown trout. Like, we don't get up to that 600 millimeter mark for the lake. Generally speaking, we're down to like the 500. But the cool thing is, in the past 2 years, we have this spike in juvenile fish captured in our fall sampling. And also, and that's a big part of why we're seeing like the most fish that we've captured in all the years of sampling, is because all of a sudden we have these big size classes of juveniles for the brown trout as well as the red band. And then bringing in the spring sampling for the past, for the first 3 years of that, no overwinter survival. But then this year, all of a sudden, we get this huge spike in red band that made it through the winter and survived in that reach. And so we've got this recruitment happening, which is awesome and really exciting, because for this whole reach of river, like, we've done nothing except change the fact that we have water in it all of a sudden.
That's not no.
No.
Just saying.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you know, there's been no restoration, there's been no work on it, it's just been a floating, which is
Super cool, refrigerated.
yeah. And so to sort of hit the high points, the brown trout dominate the system. Their numbers, they're the largest fish in there, and there's, you know, and so that just gives them that added advantage. Their numbers for the past year for the red band and the brown trout, the numbers were higher for total abundance. And then the juveniles was a huge thing leading to that bigger number for both species. Whitefish numbers, they're relatively stable, but again, we sort of cut off what we capture at a certain point. And so, but they also had, you know, a large juvenile class that helped have us a big bump in total fish this year. But then all of a sudden we're getting over winter survival for brown trout and red band, which is awesome. Also, their condition is improving. Another really cool thing. The one downer is that we do kind of see non-native fish species that are like affiliated continue to be captured in this reach. I think it was breech pine stickleback, some tui chub, and maybe brown bullhead this year. I don't know if we got bullhead in that, but those are the three that we consistently see in that reach. Again, the reservoir is not screened, so if those are there and they go through, we got them. So then jumping into the next thing, the North Canal Dam fish passage. Our role in this was sort of to determine the efficacy of the passage structure. And we do that using pit tags and pit tag antennas. And as you can see in the photo, I can find the mouse. So that orange dot in the middle, that's the where we store the nodes for the antennas. And then down here where I'm rolling the mouse around, that's one of the antennas, and then there's another up here. And so you can tell that the fish have gone in and that they've also successfully passed through the antenna. And the fish ladder was built in 2017, and the antennas were added in 2018, I believe, when PWC got funding for that, or helped with that at least. And the tagging began in 2018. And so we go out and electrofish down below there and sort of capture as much as we can. In 2023, we added another 31 fish. And this is all stuff that we've reported on in the past. This looks at lengths of fish tagged and detected at the North Canal Dam. And then we looked at time of year for successful fish passages and how that related to flow and also the species, whether it was red band or brown trout. And then this sort of looks at passage time of day. And again, this is stuff that we've talked about in the past, so I'm kind of glossing over it. And so then this year, of those fish, there were 3 successful upstream passages in 2023. There's no new trends, like they fit snugly within the data that we've already collected and reported on, so we didn't really get that deep into it. One of them was in August, one in September, one in October, and then they were all during daylight hours. No new or exciting stuff there. And, you know, to really get into it, like the work over the past, 6 years has shown the efficacy of this ladder. The fish do pass through it. It demonstrates the importance of fish passage and screening to protect and enhance connectivity within the chutes. Obviously, we still have that one big barrier a little bit upstream that people like to talk about, get all feisty. But this was an important part to demonstrate that does need to happen up there eventually. And then because we sort of feel that we have, done what we set out to do, we're talking about discontinuing monitoring passage and pulling those antennas to use in another system. And also stopping tagging fish in that reach for that reason. All right, then we've got macroinvertebrate sampling that we did in the basin. And so again, for background, this is all the same sort of background for everything, but the Chutes Basin Habitat Conservation Plan was released in 2020. And it dictates the flow regime for the chutes over the next 30 years. And 100 CFS is that minimum winter flow years 1 through 7, and it goes up to 400 by year 13. And the macroinvertebrate sampling was something that we decided to do to help establish baseline ecological conditions with that 100 CFS before we see the next bump to 300 and then eventually 4. And macroinvertebrates are awesome to use because they are excellent ecosystem health indicators. The collection of them is really easy. Their dispersibility is limited, and so they sort of stick around where the conditions led to them being born, and so it helps you to track spatially a lot better. They have short lifespan. Their tolerances to abiotic factors are low, and so they're very responsive to environmental conditions in the river. And then they're also fish food, right? So that helps us to say, oh, well, maybe this place we're not going to see as many fish because there's nothing for them to eat. And it also helps identify issues with thermal ranges, pollution, and habitat changes like sedimentation, because again, they're really responsive to these things, and specific bug communities evolve in places where they're impacted by different environmental factors. And so you can kind of get a better look at what you would expect that river to be like based off of the macros that you find there. And so this map shows the locations where we sampled. We did above and below the North Canal Dam because there's a very distinct flow regime change at that dam. That's where we pull out all the water for all the irrigation. And so that drops down to 80 to 100 CFS there in the summer. And then it bumps back up to 600 in the winter. And then it's, you know, you guys know how crazy it is in that system. And then we also did sampling in 3 tributaries. We've got Tumalo Creek here. And then we did some in the Little Chutes down here. And then also Fall River up here as sort of a reference sites for the main stem of the river, because theoretically those aren't going to change that much. We did 19 total sites. There were 7 below the dam, 6 above it, and then 2 for each tributary. And then this gets into the results from 21 and 2022 because of there's the lag for sample processing, and then also finding funding, because as Chris mentioned earlier, we're a little hamstrung on that with the program. And so we did collect in 2023. Currently, we don't have the money to do anything with them. So they're in our lab at the office. But this gets into the first 2 years. And even those 2 years, I think we found grant funding for a partial coverage on both of those years. So this graph is for the macroinvertebrate total abundance. And on the y-axis, you have total abundance, and then river mile on the x. Just to help you picture it, I could have added this to the graph and just thought of it. Downstream end is the lower numbers, and so to the left, and the right side of the graph is upstream. And as you can see, there is a gentle trend of increasing macroinvertebrate numbers as you move downstream. As you might expect, the river gets bigger, gets a little warmer, can support more primary production and therefore more macros. And then the graph maxes out at around 5,000 individuals. And then for the tributaries, because those don't really fit into the river mile all that well, and I struggled with how to build that graphic to include them. The Little Chutes, their total numbers there were really low, 81 in one of the sites up to 737. And for perspective, 500 is sort of the minimum number that gets analyzed in the lab. So we didn't even hit that number for 3 of the 4 samples that came out of Little Chutes, and we barely did in the one at the 737. Fall River, the numbers range from 1,290 to 3,885, and Tumalo Creek had one low blip at the 838, but then it also had one of the higher values in the whole system at 4,656. And then this shows the EBT tax of richness on the graph on the left. And the Shannon Weaver Diversity Index on the right, and these two are kind of related measures of richness within the system. And you have, again, on the x-axis, you have river mile, and so further to the left is downstream, and to the right is upstream. And as you can see, again, those move in a downstream direction, sort of get better as you go. Because again, you got more food, you got more water that's a little bit warmer, you can have more species that can utilize all of those different niches that develop in that sort of a system. And so that's sort of as you would expect, but generally speaking, we would like to see higher values across the board. And then, all right. And then we also took all of that data and built a Bray Curtis, the similarity index, which looks at your numbers of each individual species. And so it analyzes the species composition of each individual site, and it uses the dendrogram to visualize that. And so the closer the sites are on the chart, the more closely related they are. They have more of the same species and at the same abundances than the other ones. And so the graph on the top shows the data from 2021, and the one on the bottom is 2022. And this sort of shows like how quickly things can change with the macroinvertebrate community, in that the only sites that grouped together the same from 2021 to 2022 was the Little Deschutes River. Everything else kind of moved all throughout, you know, like the structure of the dendrogram is different. And then also where sites appear on the dendrogram is different as well. Little Deschutes is consistently low abundance and low diversity. And so there it is together in the red circles, number 16 and 17. And then just to make it, you know, even more complicated and visually busy, we put it all together and did both years on the same dendrogram to see how those sites tracked with each other in comparison to everything else. And so again, the closer the sites are together, the more related they are and more similar from year to year. The interesting thing that we saw was the Steelhead Falls and Foley Waters sites both grouped together beside each other from year to year. And then also the stretch of the river that we sampled in the COID diversion reach, so in the siphon reach, also grouped together. And our take on this is that those sites are fairly stable ecologically speaking. Steelhead Falls and Foley Waters, they are hugely spring influenced, and so they have a lot of cold water coming in there. There's a lot of great habitat. And so even when you have these changes, you know, with the, you know, warming or the heat bubble or whatever, like these sites can maintain where they are a lot better than the others. And then the COID diversion is also like a really weird outlier in terms of conditions, because there's that FERC mandated minimum of 400 CFS year round there. So even in the winter, they can't take out water that drops it below there. And so that's also like a relatively really stable site. And so everything else is, you know, there's some other sites that are kind of relatively close to each other, but those were the ones that like stood out and were, you know, sort of struck me as like interesting. But if you get into the report, we talk about a lot more of this, but it's like 60 pages. So I tried to hit the highlights here. Also, Little Deschutes, again, number 17, consistently bad. And so there they are together. So macroinvertebrate sampling, again, it's a great measure of baseline conditions and can quickly change from year to year. And so it's good to have like that consistency of throughout years, as opposed to like one grab of a year and then say that's what we're supposed to look like. And then it also shows locations with environmental stability, which is really cool. And then the changing quickly to year is also somewhat problematic. And because we can continue to collect these samples, but the budget might not allow for processing at this point, which is sort of a bummer, but that's where we are with that. Next, we'll get into the young year trout monitoring. This is a protocol that I decided to do because sampling a river like the Deschutes is really hard. and it takes a lot of people and it's time consuming, especially if you want to have like any sort of like rigorous data to come out of it. And so with this, I do sampling in margins, and it can help show like where the spotting bearing habitat is. It requires fewer personnel. I go out by myself with a backpack shocker. And it's an understudied life stage, generally speaking. And then this is the map showing all the sites that I do. I sort of tie them in with where those macroinvertebrate sites are on the main stem of the river. I don't hit the tributaries because I just haven't done that yet. But because these sites I can do by myself and I don't need to recruit like a team of 5 people, I can get greater spatial coverage because there's lower effort. Like I can just go out for 2 weeks by myself as opposed to needing that much personnel over time. And so there's 13 different sites that I do. And so this is what we get out of it. I do 3 pass depletion estimate on each site. And then I take that data and I use it to generate a trout abundance per mile measure. On the graph, it's just showing the numbers for one bank, because clearly I'm only shocking the one at a time. I could blow it up into 2 banks and have the total, but then the trend looks exactly the same. So I've just left it as is. And so the middle of the chutes is the reach to the right. The blue line is where the North Canal Dam is, right there. And the sites go from Tenino, just below Wickiup, all the way down to Steelhead Falls. And so generally we see higher numbers in the middle of chutes, so on the right side there. And the cool thing to notice is that we see similar trends like for all 3 years. The black is 2021, blue is 2022, and orange is 2023. And it also helps to indicate environmental conditions that help control recruitment. Now we can see where we're having better success with that. And so to tie it into something previous, remember where I talked about the Steelhead Falls and Foley Waters and the COID being really stable sites? Check that out. COID, Steelhead Waters, or Steelhead Falls and Foley Waters also have like higher numbers of those juveniles in those reaches, which is really cool to be able to like tie together more than one component of our monitoring. And yeah, these higher values occur where there was better environmental stability shown by the macroinvertebrates. And again, this is, it helps to give us a good indicator of river conditions because we can sort of space that out better than we do with like our adult sampling. We do 2 locations and it takes us, a really big effort to make that happen. And then this data can help us prioritize our conservation actions. And we might develop insights that we might miss with our, one location adult sampling within the river. Lastly, we'll get into the brown bullhead removal and diet study that was up on Crane Prairie. There was an illegal introduction, Crane Prairie, in the 1980s of brown bullhead. They've been around since then, but the way that the flows were managed up until the past 6 years, Crane Prairie got drained first because it leaks more than Wickiup. And so for water conservation, we took the water out of that one first. And in doing so, we de-watered a lot of the reproductive area of these brown bullhead and a lot of these other warm water species. There wasn't as much of a littoral zone and vegetation wasn't there. However, and so we've seen sort of a explosion in those in the reservoir. But the problem being is that now that we're keeping the water in there because Oregon spotted frog needs it and it's a hot spot for their breeding, these are also a potential predator and their population's doing better now. So it's a bit of a catch-22. We also see escapement of these from the reservoir. And then for the past 2 years, this was grant funded. So it wasn't paid for with the COID money. And so We collected stomach samples for eDNA analysis. We partnered with USGS to make that happen. They're the ones that are actually running the analysis, and as yet, we haven't heard what they found. But we did experimental efforts in 2019 and 2021 before we had the grant funded part. And those 2 years removed a total of 28,490 pounds, which for reference is about, 6 hippopotamuses worth of biomass. And so what we see is that, with the addition of the past 2 years, we're up to 36,000, so we're like 7 hippopotamuses now. Last year we took out about 4,200 pounds of fish, and we estimated that at around 5,144 individuals. And the interesting thing that we saw from last year to this was looking at the size distribution of the bullhead that we captured. We picked a random day and just measured lengths on everything that we captured for both years. And so we did that in September. And the top graph shows the 2022 sampling. And there's a, again, it's a histogram. So there's a count on the y-axis and a length on the x. And so you can sort of see population structure. In 2022, we had a huge bump in little guys. So they had a great year for reproduction. However, in 2023, we didn't see that for some reason. Not sure why, but that changed. And then, just to make it easy, I boxed off the next graph because I changed the y-axis in order to show like what population structure looked like, and how that changed from 2022 to 23. And so I shrunk it down so you could actually see what those tiny little nubs are on the first few graphs. And so again, 2022 is the top, 2023 is the bottom. And for whatever reason, we didn't have a huge number of juveniles that we captured. And then that size class that we saw in the 150 to 250 range, they got bigger, shockingly. But then there's also some of those fish above them that are still a little bit bigger adults. And then in terms of our catch per unit effort, it varied over the course of the summer, but ultimately not by a lot. I mean, this graph goes from 0 to 1. So we're at an average of 0.48 for the summer. And then we'll look at the catch per unit effort. That's the top graph. Catch per unit efforts on the y-axis and the years on the x. And so first you have 2019 and 2021. And those years we had a huge catch per unit effort. It was around like 7 fish per hour. And then it dropped in 2022 down to, I think it was 0.2, and then up to 0.48 in 23. The hours that we fished increased by a significant amount. We had an effort going for the entire summer. We had 2 interns running it. But if you recall from my previous graph, that catch per unit effort isn't changing really seasonally. It's sort of, hovering around that number all summer long. And so I'm not sure what's going on with that. And then because we were doing our trapping to look at a diet analysis as well, we trapped in sites that were known to have frog breeding and ones that didn't. And so that's what the frog sites and non-frog sites part is. And as you can see, the trapping hours were relatively consistent between the two. There were more non-frog site trapping hours because sort of as the season went on and the reservoir dropped, it made some of those inaccessible for our nets and for the boats to get into there to run them. And so that's why there's a bigger number. In the earlier part of the year, the frog sites had more hours of effort. But with that in mind, like the pounds that were removed from the frog sites versus non-frogs is vastly different. It's like a 5 times greater number of fish where frogs aren't known to occur. And then also the fun thing too is that the catch per unit effort is significantly higher in those non-frog sites. It's at 0.67 compared to 0.02, which was also really interesting. And then, to sort of hammer it all home, the catch per unit effort was higher than the previous year. By a decent amount, although they're both still pretty low. There were much less juvenile bullhead for some reason. We still have escaping from the reservoir, we're still picking them up in our electrofishing in the river down below. And then we did collect, I think it's in the neighborhood of, it's hundreds, 200 to 400, I think, samples that we sent off.
Yeah.
For diet analysis for the bullhead. We also sent off some bass and brook trout as they were opportunistically captured, because they're also potential predators. And again, we haven't, heard from USGS in terms of what they found or if they're done with the analysis or whatever. And then temperature monitoring, that's something that we sort of track the temperature in the locations that are on the opposite ends from the city. And so we have sites that go up to Spring River. Yeah, up to Spring River. And then we stop at just upstream where you guys start, and then we pick up downstream of where you guys stop and go down to Steelhead as the end of our reach that we have monitored. And again, like you said, struggle a lot with the loggers disappearing, and so our data is spotty. And we sort of have that in computer and sort of look at it in terms of trying to help understand some of the other trends that we see with the fish or the macro data, but haven't done any sort of real comprehensive analysis like you guys have done. And then stuff that I've also done over the past year and, collaborative effort was with the Crane Prairie Reservoir Diet Study. All those fish that we took diets on, we donated to the High Desert Museum, feed the otters, the raptors, that kind of thing. Also worked on spawning ground surveys in the upper Deschutes for both red band and brown trout. Did Little Deschutes River fish sampling. We did some e-fishing in there with the raft and the river itself, and also the Gilchrist Mill Pond, just to sort of see what's in there, helping with the talks about fish passage on that pond and supporting data to encourage it to happen. Also supported the Lava Lake Tui Chub removal and the East Lake removal as well. And then I went and was present and helped out with the Lava Island Fish Salvage as well. Moving into the future, I'll continue doing all of this stuff. The North Canal Dam is not on the list, but then I'm also looking to get into more off-channel sampling of like locations like the Dead Slough and things like that, just to see what's going on in those parts of the river, because we don't really have data either for fish or macros or temperature or anything. And a lot of that is a part of the grant that we just put in for OWEB with EDWC. And so hopefully we get that funding and we can make that happen. And then, yeah, if we have time, there's questions. If not, write down my email and read the report and then ask me a question.
To jump in together sometimes, but yeah, tons of good data there, and we've got some time for questions. One thing I was just gonna mention is I know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is planning a potential project at Dead Slough, and it just was out there with site visit last week. I just think there's a good opportunity to combine some of the monitoring there, talking about doing related to that project with what you're doing. So there's a good collaboration opportunity there.
A question that I've got, Ben, is back to your note of your finding there that you've got reduced condition factors generally across native and non-native species, but parallel increase in relative abundance there. Is that just a density dependent observation, you think? Is it as simple as that?
That is one of the thoughts that I had, is that could be the case. Theoretically, the macros are still working to, bump their numbers up because they still, got area to colonize theoretically with the extra wood width. And so the food base might be, you know, working its way up, but like. The thing that I think is interesting is that both the trout species went up, but the whitefish is the one that went down. And I even truncated the analysis, so I didn't look at fish below 250 millimeters because those little guys get all squirrely. They have these huge, you know, like 0.1 of a gram makes a massive difference in the condition factor. So I don't have a great answer, but that was one of my thoughts as the possibility. And so maybe there's just more trout for them to compete with, and so they're not as much of a football as they used to be.
Are you seeing spatial distribution shifts over time and just where you're observing presence of macros and associated predators with the increased flows and inundation?
That's a good question. I haven't done that deep of a dive into that data, as
Anecdotally, even, or you generally think you're observing any shifts to more, you know, quote unquote backwater utilization by prey and predators?
I don't know, because we haven't done really much in the way of backwater sampling, you know, stuff, like I said, at all. And so I don't have a good answer.
That might be something just to, I would just generally say would be of keen interest as we move forward with the HCP objectives of, you know, associated, you know, backwater habitat restoration, et cetera.
Yeah, that is a big component of the grant that we put in, was doing macro sampling in the backwaters as well as bite nets to see sort of adult presence, and then running minnow traps to see what little guys get in there. And so, and also temp logging in there. And so it's kind of a comprehensive look at what's going on in the backwaters, because like you said, I mean, as that flow goes up for over winter, like all of a sudden we're gonna have potentially a lot more habitat to stay water. But, you know, and then it's gonna get weird too, because theoretically with those conservation improvements in water, like our summer flows are gonna drop a little bit, so it won't be as big in summer. And so there's like a lot of, we don't know what's going on in there now, so how are we gonna know it's changed, right? And so that was a big part of the grant.
One last, if I could bogart the whole Q&A session. Well, on my way, I stopped. Bullhead numbers were relatively small downstream of Wiki up there, and observations. Is that largely just a think? To what degree was that an artifact of not getting down to run of the river in the last couple of years versus just not really selecting for that benthic species when you're going for, you know, the browns and whitefish and
Yeah, I mean, so when we sampled, the river's only at 100 CFS. So theoretically, we're getting pretty good coverage, and, you know, a lot of the rivers not pretty shallow.
Yeah.
And so, and even the ones that we're seeing, they're mostly like in the, you know, 300 millimeter range, like little guys. And so I mean, it's been a while since we've seen adult bullhead in there. At least in that particular reach. What's happening downstream where there's a bit more slow water and backwaters and stuff like that, I couldn't say. It's a big effort just to get those few reaches done. And so, yeah, I don't know. I like to think that having a small pool in that reservoir and Wiki Up is gonna prevent them from finding that outlet and coming through. But I can't say with any sort of, certainty.
sure. Thanks.
But I think, you know, I think that's also possibly something that's got to do with why we aren't seeing as many of the, you know, brown trout over 600 or the red band over 500. I feel like that was a lot, that was influenced by fish coming from the reservoir out into that region. Again, we've had that pool that kind of doesn't encourage them necessarily as much as Run River would to go through. So, yeah.
Probably multi-factor, both things going on or several things going on there.
Yeah.
Well, the bullhead capturing continue? I can't remember if that was on your slide for what.
That's not something that we got the money for this year. There's the possibility that we'll have a small effort, maybe just in August. Because we have interns for the year, but they're dedicated to truck removal up on East and Paulina, just East Lake. East Lake, through the spawning season for the Tucho. But then what they do once that spawning is done and they're not capturing anything, we're still talking about it. But they could potentially go to train for a short run at the bullhead.
Thanks. All right,
Is there time for more questions or?
we can take the time.
Well, I want to make sure nobody is somebody on, Zoom call might have some too, but I have a few. They do. I mean, like,
I can go short, go for it.
Yeah, go for it, Ted.
but to begin with, I just want to say, Drexel, your report was incredible. And then in saying that, I just wanted to say that, the work that ODFW is doing there is based on the money they have for it's phenomenal in terms of the baseline work relative to, the flow increases. And so it's my understanding that in 2027, is that it will increase, get the next increase in the river, is that correct? From 100 to.
That's when that's July, that's when it's supposed to happen.
to
200 is what
Year 7, it started in 21.
Oh, it started.
It's like December of 20 is when it came out, so like 2021, basically like that.
Okay.
January of 28 should be up there.
Okay. And
Depending on where the measuring line starts, yeah.
Year 7.
So we got 200.
yeah, okay. So again, that perspective, I still think that relative to, what you're seeing, relative to the increases in juvenile density and tracking those age classes through the next number of years is really important in terms of helping, to lay the groundwork to see then what we see after the next increase. The ground trout condition factor is interesting too, because with Wikia being drawn down, and by the way, in your report, there is a contradiction. It says that it is screened initially, and then you say it's not screened.
I think I said it frames.
Potentially, I have to go back and read it again. But without having a kokanee, the brown trout are more vociferous. They don't have that any of as much of the smaller fish that are moving out of the reservoir, particularly the kokanee. So that might, be something that may contribute to your condition, lesser condition factor.
Yeah, but even we didn't see kokanee in either of the years. In either of the years. Like that kokanee 22, they didn't have.
Right.
Well, in terms of what we have here.
Right. We can talk later. Sure. I don't want to dominate the conversation. So, and then on your graphs, it'd be nice to you have your graphs laid out relative, and many of them relative to days of the year. It also would be nice to have those kind of laid out, monthly in terms of illustrated graphically. So you can look at the months just for the general populace to see, because it's easier to track a monthly notation relative to the days during the year. And then what is the cost of the macroinverted analysis?
It's around $300 per sample for processing.
Is that part of the OWEB grant?
Yeah, we put into that for just the upper. The OWEB grant is specific to above North Now Dam. But we did put in some money for macro processing for that reason.
Right. Yeah. And one last question. Well, could you remind me of where your macroinvertebrate sampling is done, conducted on shoots?
So there's the stretch where we have those 4 ODFW properties. And that's where one sample came from, and then the other one came from, further downstream, I forget the exact spot.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks, and again, I just. Incredible job, thank you.
So I have a quick question. Is it reasonable to infer that the fish population data you've collected between the dam and Wyeth is indicative of the trends lower in the river, or does this data really restrict to that one reach of the river?
That's a hard question, but I would say. To a certain point, it probably is indicative of what we see downstream of there, but at a certain point, we have all those tributaries come in, and so.
Right.
Effects of the dam release and the irrigation water becomes muted once you get past. Like Fall River and Little Deschutes and Spring River all coming in, so. It
Yeah.
becomes less of a. Hard line once you get past there, but I would say up until you get to there, then probably, yeah.
I've always been intrigued by the idea of doing some of this monitoring below the Fall River. As at this point, it basically doubles the flow in the Deschutes, and seeing what fish populations are doing there. But I know funding is limited, but it's one of those things that I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, in the winter, it like triple or quadruples it coming in down there. I mean, when you only have 100 coming out of the dam.
Yeah, and you've got basically 100 coming out of the Fall River, so the one tributary doubles the size of the Deschutes.
There is 2015 data that I believe used the same young of year sampling method been described, that basically showed very low effective number of breeders from Wakey up to Fall River, and then more, sort of substantially more below Fall River, which would be consistent with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Find that report.
All right, well, let's keep moving through presentations, and then hopefully we'll have additional time for more conversation at the end. Just trying to keep us moving a little bit, but I appreciate all the good conversations that come with questions.
Am I up next?
You are, Jay.
Okay, how are we doing on time?
We're about 15 minutes past the schedule, but hours.
All right, Ben briefly mentioned that, he's helped the district support with our spawning ground surveys. I'm just gonna kind of, give a big picture summary and some long-term trends in mostly red band focus, but a little bit on brown trout as well from our annual red counts that we do in spawning ground survey. So what is a red count exactly? It's where we go out and I'll talk a little bit in some slides later about how we identify reds, but a red count is used to estimate the adult breeding population size, track trends in abundance, in areas where there's salmon, it can be used to track salmon escapement, the number of fish that made it through the fishery. And it can be done as either repeat surveys throughout the entire spawning season or at a single point in time. The surveys I'm going to talk about today are a single point in time at the end of the spawning season. We do repeat surveys for like bull trout, and it just requires more rigor and more repeat visits. There is the potential for observer bias and a fair amount of difference in observer efficiency when you do red count. And so we do at the beginning of every season go out together and do like a calibration check and do kind of side by side counts and discuss identification of reds. And then we also, some of this data is collected in concert with Forest Service staff. So we like to intermix our crews and kind of calibrate by having folks work together. So in this picture, what we were looking for out there is light colored patches of gravel. There's a real nice obvious red here in the front of this gravel bar, and then there's another one a little less obvious in the back. And so what is a red? A red is just a nest that salmonids have dug to deposit their eggs in. The female will dig a pit and essentially bury their eggs. Depending on the species and the size, these pits and the red size can be vastly different depending on the size of the fish. And salmon tend to be larger than trout because they put all their energy into this, and they're gonna die after they spawn. So they tend to make larger reds, and they tend to be larger in size. The pit that's dug provides for hyporheic flow and oxygenation of the eggs that are in the gravel while they're incubating. And so what this does is it disturbs all the algae and flips and turns rocks over. And so what we're initially looking for when we're looking for reds is a lighter colored patch of gravel. And then we'll go in once we see that, and we'll identify how many pits and mounds. You'll see a mound after the pit, which is called the tail spill. And so what does the red look like? Areas where the gravel's been disturbed, it's usually lighter in color than the surrounding areas. And as I mentioned, then we'll go in. Oftentimes when you have big gravel bars, you'll have quite a few reds on top of each other or near each other. And so you'll have to kind of walk carefully to not step in them, but identify how many actual pits there are that have been dug. When our red survey is conducted, this is a periodicity table for the Upper Deschutes River. We've got spawning in these rows here, and we conduct our red band trout spawning surveys in early May. So you want to hit the end of the spawning period. You want to not wait too long, or the reds they'll get covered over with algae and macrophytes, and you won't be able to identify them very easily. And for brown trout, we do them in late November. What we also do is we get a count of live fish that are still in the system, and that helps us kind of track, the spawning periodicity through time, but it also lets us know if we were too early or too late doing our red surveys. If we want to still see a few adults in the system, but not a whole lot of active spawning fish. Where do we conduct red surveys? So for red band, we do a lot of stream miles. So over here where the cursor is, we do Fall River below the falls. We do the Upper Deschutes from Little Lava Lake all the way to Crane Prairie, and then Snow Creek parallels the Upper Deschutes. We do the bottom couple miles of Cultus River. We sometimes, not every year, do Cultus Creek, which drains out of Cultus Lake. We do a very short segment in Quinn River. And then we do this section between Crane and Wickiup. We do Browns Creek, which is a tributary, major spawning tributary for Wickiup Reservoir. And then we also do Odell Creek, which connects between Odell and Davis Lake. And and then below Wickiup, we've started doing with a raft mounted platform, observation platform. So we put a considerable effort into this. Forest Service helps greatly with person power to help cover all these river miles. So these are kind of hot off the press for 2024. We did this about a month ago. So these are the red counts. We have all kinds of segments. So from Little Lava to Crane Prairie is almost 10 miles. And so I think we have 8 reaches in there. So this is summarizing all those reaches. We had about 1,600 reds this year in that reach. So that is really a stronghold for red band in the whole basin. And it's a place where ODFW has historically set up a weir and collected adults to actually have a rainbow red band types, a stock of fish that we propagate and stock throughout the state. So very important area for red band. Snow Creek, that tributary I mentioned that parallels the upper Deschutes, has a lot of spawning. And then at the bottom here, you can see Odell Creek has a very strong population of red band as well. The other reaches are important but smaller. I'll kind of come back to some of these, like the chutes below Wikia. So you'll see some of these data again. So we have a real long data set from 1995 for the segment from Little Lava Lake to Crane Prairie, partly because of collecting the broodstock in this section. And what we had seen from 2018 to 2023 was really high numbers, historically high red count numbers. And we were kind of puzzled because we kept seeing, record numbers of fish spawning, but very, very low water in the system. And then this year we did see a drop in the red count from over 2,300 down to about 1,600 reds. And so I think what we're now finally seeing is those years of low water in like basically 2021 to 23, we didn't have outflow out of Little Lava Lake. And so there was a couple mile portion of the river, probably half mile that had no flow, and then very limited flow for part of the that section of the upper Deschutes. So I think we're now seeing those cohorts in those year classes that where there wasn't as much spawning habitat becoming adults. So we might have a few smaller year classes coming up the next couple of years is what we kind of expect. But in general, we're seeing very strong population there. So shifting to Fall River. Fall River we see mostly being utilized by brown trout and kind of a steady or even upward trend over the last 10 years. These numbers are much smaller than those counts you saw for above Crane Prairie, but we see on average about 20 red band reds in Fall River and around 75 brown trout reds. Browns Creek, I'll touch on. This is, if you haven't ever kind of been to Browns Creek, it's like many of our tributaries, completely spring fed, just comes right out of the ground. It's one of our coldest spring fed tributaries in the basin. The springs come out at 3.5 degrees C. And this historically would have been a really heavily used area for bull trout spawning and rearing. What we're seeing mostly is that Browns Creek supports the brown trout population for Wikia Reservoir. So we have over 200 and kind of a consistent trend the last 3 years in the fall of over 200 brown trout reds. We have a ton of new beaver activity in Browns Creek, which is really exciting, and one of the few places in the basin where you'll see river-wide beaver dams. And so, Ben mentioned a little bit about the draining of Wikia and a lot of fish immigrating from the reservoir, but we do continue to see that brown trout are in the system and adults are still there and they're still spawning in Browns Creek. So below Wikia Dam, this shows, the circles that are brown with white, borders are brown trout, red counts going back to 1989. And then the last couple of years over here on the right, we have some red band, counts for this reach. So this reach is pretty difficult for fish for spawning because of the flow, historically, because of the extreme fluctuations in flow between irrigation and non-irrigation season. We have to plug it in somewhere. Does that work? So historically, this reach was 20 CFS in the wintertime, and almost 2,000 CFS in the summertime. And the timing of the flow changes was really hard on fish. Red band would try to spawn in March before the irrigation season, and then the reds would tend to get scoured or sediment deposited on them. Brown trout would try to spawn or would spawn in October, and then the water would drop and a lot of the eggs and gravel bars would become desiccated. So we kind of have a sort of a low baseline of some spawning in this reach. ODFW in previous years using the COID mitigation fund has done some gravel enhancement work up there and monitored that. We've had some fish use up there, but it's not been hundreds and hundreds of red. And then you can see the last couple of years there with our red band counts. We've got about 20, and we do a longer survey as well. This is just for the tailwater. But we've had about 20 red band reds the last couple of years. So a couple other things that we're doing as we do these surveys, we've been integrating spatial data system and collecting our data on survey 1, 2, 3 this year, which will allow us to actually do point location and hotspot mapping of where all these fish are spawning. So this is just a couple mile reach in the above Crane Prairie from this year with some hotspot mapping. We also look at kind of incidental observations of fry when we're out there in the spring. You have a lot of juvenile fish that have just emerged, so we'll dip net juvenile fish when we're out doing surveys, and we'll look at you know, how large they are, what species they are, and the timing when they emerge. This also just, these floats and surveys give us a good opportunity to just observe changes and seasonal changes with discharge in the upper river. And so here's a couple pictures of some areas that we've identified and others as kind of some important off-channel habitat. And then on the right is you can see a big log here from a previous habitat project with a cable going up the bank. So this was a cable habitat project along a sloughing cut bank, but it just gives us the chance to be out there and to observe how the river is reacting to different levels of discharge. Another thing we've started 2 years ago was documenting beaver presence on the landscape, and this is a big emphasis of ODFW right now. We have another Survey 123 app where we document beaver dams, food storage caches, any recent and old observations of beaver. this big tree that was felled, this is in the upper Deschutes, about a mile below Little Lava Lake, and there's lots of new beaver activity in there. And then this is one of those river wide dams on Browns Creek, from the brown trout surveys, which are often snowy. And that's what I have for today, just kind of a little summary of what we do for our red counts, and we just use those to track basic population monitoring and tracking trends through time. And then my picture over there is bull trout from the Rosolias. Yeah.
Jerry, when did you say you started monitoring the beaver activity, just in the last couple of years?
Yeah, as we rolled out the app and it became more of a priority in 2022, we started really kind of trying to document where we saw recent beaver activity.
So Jerry, and maybe the new regional watershed manager can speak to it too. Like, what's the ODFW's current take on beaver trapping?
That's
last week. There's more of a permit process now involved with beaver removal. We're trying to collect more data and information about beavers in the state. I think the next issue is tell you more. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they're not just a fur bearer anymore, and they're out of that predator, not just rodent status that they have before.
There's a story about that in the bulletin, I think, this morning. I didn't
Okay,
read
well-
it, but I just saw the headline.
Hopefully it's accurate. Yeah, so yeah, beavers have changed.
Or not just a fur bearer?
Not just a fur bearer.
You're only a fur.
Industrious.
Thank you.
Thank you for the thought.
Yeah, there's definitely is, I'm sure this is old news to you too. As far as the cause effect relationships of trapping. There's definitely been no linear relationship correlation that's been made that's kind of universal to a given basin as to whether or not trapping or trapping moratoriums is actually having a significant effect on beaver populations. It really is site specific as best we can tell. It's an emerging story on that front.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Put her on the hot spot.
All right. Any questions on Zoom for Jerry before we switch to the next presentation? Okay, not hearing any. Thank you, Jerry. Jason, I think you're up.
Yep.
Dog.
Oh, just you wait. Mission accomplished.
Wow.
Getting your attention. Icebreaker.
There's nowhere to put it.
There's a lot of slides.
How about there?
And because, wanted to make sure that, Tim Porter's still on, he has an opportunity to say that he got to see me today. I just, put myself on video. So with that, howdy everybody, again, Jason Wilcox, Fisheries Program Manager for the Forest Service here in Central Oregon. The dog is my beloved Deschutes grassland. And with that, Chris had asked for kind of a broad representative, discussions around fish population monitoring, here in the basin. And so Tumalo Creek is one that Jerry, and Ben didn't really, speak to because it's really a focal area of survey work by the Forest Service in conjunction with the city of Bend here. And the monitoring's been conducted since 2011, or it really started up this in 2016. So have a relatively short number of slides here. We'll see if we can to advance. Bear with it. Go. So as Lori talked earlier and stole my thunder, the Forest Service has been issuing a special use permit to the city of Bend for operation of the municipal water diversion out of Bridge Creek. That again provides about 60% of municipal water for the city. That was issued in 2013 under special use permit. It outlines the operating procedures and criteria that include fish population monitoring to track the cause-effect relationship of the diversion out of Bridge Creek and the Tumalo operations as it pertains to fish population trends. So we had a baseline survey that was conducted in 2011 before updated water diversion operations began. The key here is that those new water diversion operations effectively reduced the ramping of flows and it increased the amount of in-stream flows that were returned back and not completely using the full water right by the city. So keep that in mind here. And again, as Lori noted, we have annually monitored fish populations from 2016 to 2018, and then the special use permit sites that we do this every other year. Up through this year, the city of Bend's been funding the Forest Service to do this work. And we're now have just had some initial conversations and an interest in renewing that fish population monitoring
I'm gonna give you the dollar.
agreement. So I will ask Lori to show me the money after this talk. So that's the quick rundown on that. We saw this slide before. This is just a graphic schematic of the overall Tumalo Creek Bridge Creek water supply system here. And I'll just note that it's really in this subreach A here is where the monitoring data will be sourced from, focused on in my discussion here. The Bridge Creek diversion is located right there, and we're really effectively looking at from River Mile 5 up to River Mile 15 as our quote unquote study reach. Here's the Outback facility that Lori mentioned, returns a smaller proportion of the overall diverted flows back in stream, which is notable, or it had in the past, right? So moving on, our methodology, pretty straightforward. Historical survey methods here. We've got, in addition to that original 2011 baseline data set, which was collected not at the time to really be a control, but at the time rather just a baseline purpose for getting species presence absence. We then subsequently in 2016 established 5 200-meter reach sites, one being a control site on Tumalo Creek immediately upstream of, or about a quarter mile rather upstream of the confluence of Bridge Creek and Tumalo Creek that I'll show in the next slide. So it's out of the influence of the diversion out of Bridge Creek, and then 4 treatment reaches that go down to River Mile 5 that would effectively monitor the effects of the diversion project. And those 5 sites, they have varied habitat conditions that are representative of the whole gamut of habitats from low gradient, 1% gradient, riffle dominated up to more of a step pool, riffle dominated almost 4 to 5% gradient. So we have a good representative habitat types through there. 2 snorkel order teams with 1 data collector per site, again, survey at night, August, September survey timing, that we do our best. Not always perfect to stay consistent with the same weeks of the year that we survey this work for consistency. So here's that control site. Again, Bridge Creek right here, where the intake facility, the diversion is located, and then this 32 is the control that's actually up the main stem, Tumalo Creek, upstream and out of the influence of the intake operations. And then these other sites here, they're numbered kind of randomly because we've had some out of sequence changes through the years in our numbering convention. So that's all that's going on there. And then the site 29, just for orientation, that's right at the bridge accessing Tumalo Falls coming up the road and across that bridge, if you're familiar with that. So 2022, just lumped data findings here, both red band and brook trout were noted in the surveys, and of note here. Fortunately, last year, from just a native fishery standpoint, we did not have any brown trout, but that wasn't universal to all the years, which I'll speak to going forward. So the control site here, again, out of the influence of the project, of the diversion project here, as a whole, has been seeing this steady decline in red band and then an increase in brook trout since 2017, primarily in that less than 200 millimeter sub-adult size classes. The reason that the YOY numbers are so few is because of exactly what Ben and Jerry already noted. Snorkel surveying is notorious for underrepresenting the amount of YOY less than 50 millimeter size class of red band. And that's, again, not really so much of our focus of this study, but it is a shortcoming that is important to acknowledge. And then we do see some of those larger fish, and they've also been declining a little bit recently on the red band side. And we're seeing some brook trout shifts into a little bit of a larger size class as well. So going to the project sites or the treatment affected sites, this is just one site 23 of those other out of the 4 here, and it's just representative of all 4 sites in general. We've not seen a really distinct trend in red band count since 2017, but we've continued to see a pretty marked significant increase in brook trout in all but one site, 18 there. Very few brown trout, not noted on this slide here, but we've seen a handful, less than 5 brown trout observations in the past 2 survey years, 2020 and 2022. But they are starting to show up. Previous to 2020, we had not seen brown trout in the study reach at all. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. total fish, from 2011 on with, important asterisks down here. We didn't have, surveys in a couple of reaches in 2016, just due to some, staffing and capacity issues that came up. But overall here, the takeaway is that, we're seeing a pretty static and stable red band trout, relative abundance here since we've had the permit underway with the improved operations, minimizing ramping and retaining more in-stream flows. So that appears to be, quote unquote, working. With one also important note that relative abundance of brook trout seems again to be increasing, and we got a number of hypotheses as to what's driving that. One of them that we are seeing is that we're starting to see some filling of some pools, some backwater, warmer water conditions in some of the off-channel, side-channel habitats, potentially due to some wood placement and restoration work that the Forest Service conducted in 2014 and 2015. That seems to be favoring the more slow water and warmer water habitats that brook trout favor, as opposed to the colder, faster water habitats of red band. But it's a little bit too early and too small of a data set to jump to any particular conclusions. Brown trout are again starting to show up here, but albeit in really small numbers. And one maybe saving grace, I would say, to think about here is that we do have smaller falls. That's that River Mile 8 downstream on Tumalo Creek. That may be precluding or limiting the upstream movement potential for brown trout over time. But overall, these are sympatric species that are coexisting quite readily from what we've seen, not to the excessive detriment of red band, and that's the key here, I think, overall. So with that, just wanted to give kudos. This is one of the sites in the side channel I was speaking to, is back behind this log jam here, and it's largely been filling in over time, and it shifted from red band to almost exclusively brook trout back in this alder gallery. You'll just have to take my word for it. So we're seeing some shifts that we're expecting overall, and kudos to a boatload of coordination among a lot of biologists in Central Oregon through the years, including this old character that I know a number of you in the room remember. So good old Thomas Alva, we're carrying his legacy forward with pride. With that, TGIF.
Some questions online or here in the room?
I'm interested if there's anything to add in that stretch from Watershed Council, because you guys did a big restoration project, but it was like 20 years ago in this area. And I'm so interested to see who we had, and I didn't know about your restoration project in 2014 too, just like putting this whole story together of this stretch of stream. And so we saw, so there's more water in it now, and in some, at least shoulder periods of time. So flow, temperature benefits, there's been a couple of different restorations, if these fish counts, I think there's a story to put together.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that for starters on the story, I noted that the city doesn't have our most recent report posted. I see the previous year's one, but I think we got an interest in putting together a story map, I think, that would tie this together, and that the wood that you're seeing there is legacy wood from the combination of the Watershed Council's partnership with Forest Service work, as well as supplemental wood placement by the Forest Service in the mid-teens there. And we're recognizing that that is starting to break down, and like it or not, you know, this is a heavily managed reach with a lot of riparian impacts that have occurred. So we're not at the point, in other words, of having natural recruitment to the degree that we would need to be able to just say that we're no longer need to do supplemental wood placement, would be my perspective. So I think there's an opportunity, especially as conspicuous as this reach is to the public and all, for us to, you know, document maybe through a story map what that history through the 2000s has been, as a kind of a springboard for maybe considering going back in future years to protect.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Yeah, and, you know, the Watershed Council project goes back so far that most of our staff, we have one staff member that's still here, but, you know, we can certainly get back into some of the reports and the media stories about that and help tell that story. So, yeah, I like that idea.
It's not at all a shocker that we're seeing, you know, strong correlation with fish, highest fishing numbers, that's where it is, where that cover is. But again, that wood is starting to break down and meter out through the system, even in a spring bed system like this, when the wood breaks down small enough, it does start to flow down, and we're starting to see more of a constriction in where the fish are being located, because the wood's just not distributed as broadly as it was 15, 20 years ago.
So the 2022 fish monitoring report is up on the website.
Oh, okay, well, maybe I was sleepless with crazy little kids.
Maybe what had him put up.
Let's switch gears. We got one more presentation from Lauren here, and then we'll make some space for some closing conversation and discussion.
Keep it short. Can folks on Zoom hear me through the mic in the room?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, so I can keep it short today. Essentially, I'm going to speak about Upper Deschutes Watershed Council stream temperature monitoring on the Upper Deschutes and tributaries, and I'll just note that those tributaries are Tumalo Creek and Whitehouse Creek, and Whitehouse is clearly outside of the geography of the M&E funding, so we can just skip over that. It'll make my presentation shorter. So I was starting to put together slides and was pulling out of our Upper Deschutes and Middle Deschutes stream temperature and water quality report, and was just struck by this map where all of the red lines are reaches that were 303 delisted for temperature as of the 2018 to 2020 report. I remember looking at this data and thinking, all of those tributaries on the Metolius are listed. That's interesting. I believe the assessment units have changed since that 2020 report, and these are old data. But as it pertains to the Upper and Middle Deschutes and Tumalo Creek, as well as Whitehouse, essentially all of those reaches are 303 delisted for not meeting salmon and trout rearing and migration temperature criteria, which is 18 degrees Celsius. So the context of the Watershed Council's stream temperature monitoring is sort of twofold: one, status and trends, but two, really specifically producing the data, the stream temperature data, to be used with stream flow data from Oregon Water Resources Department to be able to evaluate changes in stream temperature in relation to stream flow restoration that's conducted by Deschutes River Conservancy. And so our sites were initially selected within the context of the regional water quality monitoring program that the Watershed Council ran in collaboration with the city and others from 2004 to 2009. Sites were selected in all of the reaches where the Watershed Council monitors to represent the diversity of temperature conditions, to support that evaluation of the relationship between stream flow and temperature. And I already mentioned these are the reaches where we monitor. We operate under a DEQ approved quality assurance project plan and standard operating procedures. We use both Tidbit and Pro-V2 data loggers, which record temperature hourly. On Waichus, we really try to get a complete data set from April through October because of steelhead and Chinook spawning. On the Deschutes and middle Deschutes in particular, downstream of Bend, the date range during which we can collect data is limited by higher flows before irrigation season and after irrigation season. So we just try to make sure that we deploy data loggers after flows decrease and retrieve them before flows increase. And we do conduct field audits monthly, plus an additional audit after the July 4th weekend, just to make sure those loggers are still present and in the water. So our temperature monitoring stations on the Deschutes really span from upstream to downstream key locations of interest. So upstream of North Canal Dam and upstream of the city of Bend, we have a monitoring location at Pringle Falls and one at Benham Falls as sort of the control condition unaffected by stream flow restoration at North Canal Dam and Tunnel Creek. So think of that as pre-HCP control condition. We do collect data at River House, so in some of the same locations as the city, upstream and downstream of the confluence with Tumalo Creek on the Deschutes. At the mouth of Tumalo Creek, so really less than a quarter mile upstream of the mouth, right there upstream of that confluence. And then that DR 133.5 site is our site at Lower Bridge, which is our downstream most temperature monitoring location, and sort of the hottest condition, warmest condition on the Deschutes before Waichus Creek enters the Deschutes. There's about 10 miles between Lower Bridge and confluence of Waichus Creek and Deschutes. So I'm just going to present some really high level data. So these are stream temperatures from April 6th through September 18th at those 6 monitoring locations on the Deschutes and that 1 monitoring location on Tumalo Creek. Highlights in this chart, or lowlights, depending on how you want to look at them. At Lower Bridge, that maroon line, we did exceed that 24-degree temperature that is considered lethal for trout, salmon, steelhead. The 18-degree standard, you can see that we're exceeding that at all sites monitored. Trying to see if we're actually, we're missing data from, some data from Pringle Falls there. Maybe that's, sorry, the lavender is 160.25 above Tumalo Creek. But so those are sort of the key points. All sites are exceeding that 18-degree Celsius criteria. We already talked about that earlier today. And then that 133 is pretty warm. And so these are, July median, minimum and maximum temperatures at Lower Bridge at that warmest location from 2001 to 2021. So these dates only include July 1st through 22nd due to some data lots. Years for which there's only a median is the median of the days for which data were available. So that doesn't represent the full July 1st through 22nd data set. And so you can see that 18-degree dashed red criteria line at the very bottom of the chart and that 24-degree Celsius lethal threshold for the top. And I think the thing that is hopeful about this chart is that there are quite a few years between 2008 and 2020 that either very few or no 7-day average daily maximum temperature records were above that 24-degree Celsius threshold. We talked a little bit earlier about that heat dome. And you see that 2021 temperature, which was the year that the heat dome occurred, which is back above. So all values in July 2021 were above that 24-degree threshold. And then just to get an idea of what this looks like throughout the entire irrigation season in terms of suitability for fish habitat, we just calculate percent of data days. So these are data days between April 30th and September 21st. Those are days that have exceeded that 18-degree Celsius criteria historically. So on the left, we have that Lower Bridge site, DR 133.5. We see a relatively low proportion of days between 12% in 2001 and a maximum of 60% in 2011, meeting 18 degrees Celsius. The pink bars are temperatures between 18 and 24. And again, we looked at those 24-degree temperatures in the box plots. And then on the right, that site is the location at River House. So about as close as you can get to being immediately downstream of North Canal Dam. And so to me, this represents the stream temperature that's coming in at that point where stream flow can be restored at North Canal Dam. And we see that we're pretty consistently, we do meet 18 degrees Celsius for a higher proportion of days here, but we also pretty consistently exceed that 18 degrees. And so that is just, to me, a representation of that water temperature coming in there throughout the season, throughout the irrigation season, and the fact that increasing the volume or rate of that water at North Canal Dam is not going to provide a whole lot of cooling effect, given that it's already above 18 degrees Celsius. So I sort of pirated and quasi-updated this graphic from a 2012 report that the Watershed Council produced. But essentially our regression relationships between stream flow in the Deschutes at 160.25, essentially immediately upstream of the confluence with Tumalo Creek, and Tumalo Creek flow and temperature just shows what it demonstrates what makes a lot of sense, which is that if you can increase that colder Tumalo Creek flow, that will cool the middle Deschutes much more effectively than restoring stream flow at North Canal Dam. So that cold Tumalo Creek water is really what we want to be restoring to cool stream temperatures in the middle Deschutes downstream of that. And the one other thing I just wanted to highlight, and then I'll stop talking, is that we have seen since 2018 an increasing warming trend at Pringle and Benham Falls, where historically we did not see temperatures exceeding 18 degrees at these two sites. Beginning in 2018, unfortunately, we're missing data for 2018 and 2019. for July above Benham. So again, these are only July stream temperatures at those two sites, on the left, Benham on the right. And that dotted line, dotted red line is that 18-degree threshold. So we've done some preliminary analysis, trying to understand the source of this increased warming. Is it just climate change? If we look at our WikiUp July water surface elevations from 2012 to 2021, we see that that very lowest blue line is 2021, and that next lowest orange line is 2020. And so it seems like there's probably a relationship between those lower WikiUp reservoir elevations and these warmer temperatures at Pringle and Benham Falls. I'm just going to stop there. Given our timeline. Questions about that fire hose?
So the gauge right at the Waco gauge right below WikiUp too also records temperature too, so you can look at exactly what you're saying, like the relationship of reservoir elevation with actual water coming right out of the reservoir. Definitely when it gets down to below 12-14%, it's just really warming as it goes through there. It's not getting pulled off the bottom.
Yep. Especially by July.
Incredible data set.
Thank you.
And
There were
much,
people
sorry,
who
much
built
less
it.
than your, in all your work, Lauren. I can't think of a lot of data sets that are comprehensive and understanding.
Big partnership.
All right, well, that concludes the presentations. I know we wanted to make a little time, just to talk, make space for questions, but also, what did you see today or think about that creates, ideas for collaboration? Or, I agree, Ted, with your comments about, just the value of a lot of this robust monitoring and setting the stage for, having baseline data as we start going through the years in the HCP. And, I'm hopeful for, like, one example, hopefully we can get this OWEP grant that's gonna allow, Ben and Jerry at ODFW to capture even more data. So, yeah, there's a lot of positives in the amount of monitoring being done, and hopefully that can ramp up a little bit. I thought at some point during the discussion, I should have invited Aaron Kilcullen from the Soil and Water Conservation District, because I know they're also doing a little bit of monitoring and starting a program on the Little Deschutes and Upper Deschutes related to a special implementation area they have through the Oregon Department of Ag. So they've got a little more monitoring happening there. But yeah, thoughts on collaboration or needs or duplication of efforts that you're seeing, things like that?
I'll go back to the one that you brought up, Drexel, early on around the idea of, it was a suggestion that you received around trying to get a more dedicated single data clearinghouse, if you will. I can see that somewhat related to, you mentioned some of even UDWC's reporting, monitoring reports not being super readily accessible. I think there's maybe some interrelationship between data clearinghouse, monitoring reports, and maybe even telling our story better. What, like, to my point of story map, I think this data here is super valuable and of greater interest, of course, to the quote unquote choir that we're preaching to here. But I think there's going to be a need moving ahead with the HCP to make sure we really build a great bridge to this is our data, and this is the potential utilization of the data, the implications of the data, to both our internal partnership group in the industry, but also the public's going forward. So however we can put that piece together, I think it'd be time well spent to, you know, get the most bang for the buck out of Ben's, you know, super hard work and Lauren's hard work and all those dozens of people. That'd be my two cents main recommendation.
I agree. I mean, a couple of things we've talked about, there's this committee and its focus and that money in it, and I think we might be talking a little bit bigger picture than that. Collaboration on data. Drexel told me the history of previously having regular annual monitoring and data meetings. There's probably a few people missing from the room for that. But I think that's worthwhile. I feel like there's a number of things to talk about, like, are we collecting data at the right places? Are we duplicating? You know, how can that data be put together better? And the clearinghouse thing, I think, is a really interesting discussion, because I know the state agencies are working harder to, you know, have a statewide database that's available and all of that, but I do wonder about having a Deschutes focused one. And just there's the water quality stuff we've been talking about in the fish, but there's other stuff too, like the things that Deschutes River Conservancy is working on, the Deschutes Basin Collaborative work, the quantity discussion, which of course goes to quality. So I don't know, but I think it'd be worthwhile having that discussion, like, where should that type of thing reside? Who would own that web page that has these story maps and like really visual representations? Then you can dig into the data. I mean, is that somebody like the Watershed Council? Is it somebody like Oregon State? Is it?
Or is it something that's doesn't need to involve reinventing the wheel, but it's just an opportunity to improve upon the interlinking literally and figuratively between the NGOs and the governmental bodies. So if we have folks internally that are, you know, have a take a run around to get information, then you can only imagine what the publics might be out on that front, or potential, you know, foundation funders forward to help, you know, do their own research. We want to have it even more condensed into something that's palatable for more than just acquire as the audience. I think would be a good one, like simulating the take homes and the so what's of temperature across the board relative to fisheries and trends that we're seeing with climate change. So what that I think could really be boiled down to something that's more
Just from I mean, to my knowledge, this is the first time that I'm aware of that. I mean, you've got like the PGE fisheries conference and things like that, but just kind of a monitoring focused discussion, and we kind of crammed this into a few hours. But would there be interest in like an annual gathering like this, and adding some folks, but make it like a full day? And if so, like, what would be the right? I mean, and we could organize this through the M&E committee, I think, you know. But like, what would be the right time of year? Does this feel like the right time of year? It feels like Ben, Jerry, and others, you know, maybe had some recent data that you were able to pull together at this time frame, but would winter be better?
Together, like, is it calendar year or?
We run on our fiscal year, so this is, we like to meet in June with this committee ahead of our new fiscal year in July. It's also our busy field season right now, but it is a nice time to summarize all last year's data and spring data. So it is, I think June.
Yeah, those sweet spot,
Kind of good.
May/June.
Yeah.
Before we get very busy.
Well, I saw a lot of heads nodding with interest in, you know, trying to pull together an annual meeting. Yeah, I don't know, where my mind went was like some sort of dashboard that could be digestible by the public. And, you know, a lot of of the COID funds are going to the ODFW monitoring, but we do have, this committee has this pot of funds that's kind of. It sits there, maybe there's a little bit of that money that could be considered at some point in the future for some of that public facing, sharing and
A lot of the tools, I love the hotspot stuff and the survey 123. Things, PGE's getting into some and utilizing more of those Esri GIS tools in a way that actually has sort of a dashboard type of potential to take us to a lot more of a spatial messaging. That spatial messaging is gold for especially less nerdy audiences.
It's good to remember that, Esri charges online credits for any data that is perpetually served on our JS Online.
Oh.
And so in terms of hosting data in
Good.
perpetuity, you will pay, as we have recently learned.
Usually manage organization. I think
well, I personally need to wind down and get to a 12 o'clock interview, but, I think this committee typically meets every 6 months, is that right? You know, like, could we anticipate another meeting like in the winter, and then we'll plan for another June meeting? I'm just.
Yeah, I think
wanting
it'd
to
be nice,
document this and circle back with Kate when she's back.
maybe, late fall after you hear back about the grant, the web grant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the Watershed Council's reports back to 2010 are on our website, and all of our water quality data is on our website. Back to 93 or something like that. Those water quality monitoring program reports, I just looked, so from 2005 to 2009 are not on there, and I will do some digging to see if I can locate those and get them posted, because it's valuable data and history.
Yeah, if nothing else, this is a really great move, I think, to quote unquote force our hand into revisiting some of the past monitoring and current monitoring and showcasing it. I think some of it will again be a springboard to future restoration prioritization. So it's we always talk about that we're not getting enough funding for monitoring, blah blah blah. Well, part of it is just making this stuff a priority here, but also not forgetting all that was in the past decades.
One last thought, Chris, on the clearinghouse aspect of things and the repository for all the information. Is it something that, you know, potentially the Watershed Council, I'm not trying to put work without money on somebody like Lauren or other staff, but I think there was a grant that could be written specifically to have the Watershed Council be that repository where all that safe OEW, you know, from Forest comes in, and there's a link on the Watershed Council website for people to access that.
That's a relatively large program in terms of funding.
Yeah, I don't.
Well, either way, it's gonna be, wherever it goes, it's gonna cost. In terms of managing it, if it's done, you know, so it's really effective and open to whoever wants to get there. So that, I just threw that out. But
Maybe an agenda item for next fall.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know who's the right entity necessarily to be that clearinghouse, but that was part of why I brought up the, you know, you can have a dashboard that's gonna cost money and maintenance, and you know, whether it's a little bit of the pot fund or a different grant, you know, somehow you're gonna have to fund, you know, these ideas. So
It could be a clearinghouse, but it could also just be sort of a catalog of where to look and different things too, which would limit some of the management, so it would still put the onus on the individuals that are creating the data to, you know, have that up properly at their site. But I know with the DRC, we just revamped our website and it literally just launched recently, but we're trying to make it much more user friendly. But we've always had a component to our website that tried to put all the resources out there, the different reports, the different data. And part of the reason for our revamp is that's just gotten kind of cumbersome and outdated, and we need to kind of figure that out. But as we were talking about all these things, the story in particular about what we're all doing and how these things tie together and the benefits from the DRC's perspective of the flow, and how that ties into what we're seeing with fish and what we're seeing in all these different aspects of water quality. Like, I think that's definitely on a part of our mission and vision, is to start to pull those things together. So I absolutely expect the DRC will be engaged in that, and we can try to find some solutions for some of that too, which would potentially be that maybe not we're the data clearinghouse per se, but we can organize it in a user-friendly way to help tell the story and then direct people to the deeper details.
That's well said. Here in the recognition that there's still room, as much as we try to synthesize till we're blue in the face, there's still room to synthesize better or in a more holistic way. I always go back to, let's make sure we're not just talking about creating another widget without being extremely clear and all on the same page around what our underlying objectives are.
Apologies that I have to run. Thanks. Yeah, feel free to continue the conversation. Thanks, folks on Zoom, for tuning in today.
Thanks, everyone.
Seems like it went pretty smoothly. All right.
Good luck with your interview, Chris. If you're not leaving us.
It's not my interview. It's we're hiring a new educator for the water.
Good luck.
We're interview number 7 this week. I'm almost 2 more today. We do have some great candidates. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Chris.
Great, thank you.
Here's Sean.
Again, for shutting her down. Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Hey, down.
Well, I had gone over to your office, I was chatting with Kate, and Drexel had filled my head with this